Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. It wasn't the first time the hallway light flickered at odd intervals. Comings and goings were routine, a shuffle of footsteps that no one bothered to track. The mail piled neatly, except for the one envelope that always seemed to be missing. I didn't turn to see or ask who took it. It simply belonged somewhere else. The room felt a degree cooler than it should have been, and the curtains hung just a bit unevenly. I adjusted the blinds without thinking much of it. When I left, I made sure the blinds were uneven again. The humming started somewhere behind my left ear, not inside my head, but close enough that I kept reaching up to brush away what wasn't there. It had a metallic quality, like power lines in the rain, but sharper, more deliberate. The sound would cut out completely for maybe 3 seconds, then return at a slightly different pitch. I remember standing in the kitchen, coffee mug halfway to my lips, frozen because the humming had stopped and the silence felt wrong, too thick. When it started again, it was coming from the other side. There was someone in the apartment, not moving around, not making noise, just there. I could feel the weight of them in the space, the way air pressure changes before a storm. I kept checking the locks, the windows, the closet doors, everything secure. But that presence never left, hovering just outside my peripheral vision. Sometimes I'd wake up and know they were standing at the foot of the bed, patient as a cat watching prey. I'd count to 10 before opening my eyes, and of course nothing was there. Just that lingering warmth in the air where a body might have been. My thoughts kept getting interrupted. Mid-sentence, mid-action, like someone was changing the channel in my brain. I'd be brushing my teeth and suddenly find myself staring at the bathroom mirror, toothbrush still running, foam dripping down my chin. No memory of the gap between. Or I'd be reading and realize I'd been staring at the same paragraph for 20 minutes, but the words had rearranged themselves into something that made no sense. Letters swimming around like they were floating in water. I started writing things down to make sure they stayed the same, but my handwriting looked different each time. The lights came first, not the regular lights, but something else bleeding through the walls, pulsing in rhythm with that metallic humming. Blue-white and cold, casting shadows that moved independently from their sources. I pressed my palm against the wall and felt it vibrating, warm to the touch despite the chill in the air. Objects on the shelves rattled softly, a gentle percussion that seemed almost musical. Then the silence dropped like a curtain, so complete I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the walls. When I blinked, dark spots danced across my vision for several minutes afterward. The headaches started 3 days later, or maybe they'd been there all along and I was just noticing them now. A constant pressure behind my eyes, like someone had their thumbs pressed against my temples. My reflection looked tired, older somehow. Dark circles that makeup couldn't cover. I kept finding small objects in different places than where I'd left them. Keys on the kitchen counter instead of the hook by the door. My phone charging in the bathroom. Little displacements that made me question my own memory, my own actions. But sometimes I remember it differently. Sometimes the lights were warm, golden like candle flame, and the humming was almost comforting, like a lullaby hummed by someone who cared about me. In this version, the presence wasn't threatening but protective, watching over me while I slept. The objects moved because they were being arranged more thoughtfully, placed where I'd need them most. The gaps in my memory weren't interruptions, but gifts, moments of peace I was being given. The wall wasn't vibrating, it was breathing, alive and gentle. I don't try to figure it out anymore. The explanations I used to reach for feel thin now, inadequate. What matters is that something fundamental has shifted, like a bone that healed wrong after breaking. I notice things differently now. The way shadows fall at angles that don't match their sources. How certain rooms feel larger on some days than others. The way my own voice sounds slightly delayed when I speak aloud, as if the words are taking a longer route to reach my ears. I've stopped adjusting the blinds. They'll hang however they want to hang. I've learned not to look too closely at my reflection in windows at night. Some things are better left unexamined. The envelope still goes missing from the mail pile, and I still don't turn to see who takes it. But now I know it's not going somewhere else, it's going someone else. And maybe that's exactly where it belongs. Story 2. I had been watching the floorboards, eyes tracing the familiar lines where the wood met the wall. The shadows didn't shift, but something in the air felt charged, like a held breath. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the windows, a soft murmur that might have been mistaken for an echo. Each tick of the ceiling fan seemed amplified, its rhythm oddly irregular. My gaze caught the edge of the bookshelf where the dust had settled uniformly, untouched. Yet something had changed, an inexplicable lightness in the room. That's when I noticed the single bookmark lying on the floor, and that it was never mine. That was 3 weeks ago. The bookmark is still on my desk now, smooth black plastic with tiny ridges that catch my fingernail when I run my thumb across its surface. I don't remember picking it up, but I must have. I don't remember much of anything from that period, actually. There's a gap in my memory, clean and precise as a surgical cut. I know something happened to me. I can feel it in the way I move through my apartment now, checking corners I never used to notice, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looks the same, but when I stare too long, I get the unsettling feeling that it's staring back with different intentions than my own. The bookmark vibrates sometimes, just barely, like a phone on silent mode, but when I look down at it, it's perfectly still. I've started carrying it everywhere, this small black thing that doesn't belong to me, hoping it might unlock whatever door has been sealed in my mind. I found the audio file by accident. I was backing up files on my phone when I noticed a recording I didn't remember making. The timestamp shows it was created during those missing days, but the file name is just a string of numbers that mean nothing to me. When I pressed play, static filled my earbuds, punctuated by what sounded like my own breathing, but deeper, more labored than it should be. The recording runs for 17 minutes. For most of it, there's just that static, like someone breathing into a microphone from very far away. But around the 12-minute mark, there's something else. A sound that makes my chest tighten every time I hear it. It's electronic but organic somehow, shifting in frequency like a voice trying to speak through interference. I've played it back dozens of times, but I can never quite make out what it's trying to say. In the background of the recording, I can hear my own voice, muffled and distant. I'm saying something, but the words are swallowed by the static. The tone is wrong, though. I sound calm, conversational even, like I'm talking to someone I know well. But there's no other voice in the recording. Just that electronic breathing and my own responses to something I can't hear. The bookmark gets warm when I listen to the recording. Not hot, just body temperature, like it's been sitting in someone's palm. I've been having flashes, not memories exactly, but impressions that feel more real than the room around me. They come without warning, usually when I'm doing something mundane like washing dishes or folding laundry. Suddenly I'm somewhere else, seeing through eyes that might not be my own. In the first flash, I'm standing in a room I don't recognize. The walls are the wrong color, a shade of green that doesn't exist in any paint store. There are lights moving across the ceiling, but they're not casting shadows the way lights should. They pulse in a rhythm that matches the electronic sound from the recording, and I realize I'm not alone. There's someone behind me or something behind me, but when I try to turn around in the memory, the flash ends. The strange thing is, I'm not afraid in these flashes. I should be terrified, but instead I feel calm, almost drowsy, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I found the note in my own handwriting yesterday. It was tucked inside a book I haven't opened in months, written on a piece of paper I don't remember tearing from my notebook. The handwriting is definitely mine, but the words feel foreign. The sound is getting clearer, it says. I think I understand what it wants me to do. Below that, there's a rough sketch of something that might be a face, if faces could be made of intersecting lines that hurt to look at directly. The bookmark was lying on top of the note when I found it, and for just a moment the drawing seemed to shift, like it was trying to complete itself. I don't remember writing any of it, but the pen marks are deep, pressed hard into the paper like I was trying to make sure the words would stay. The second flash came while I was listening to the recording again. This time I'm in the same green room, but the lights have stopped moving. Everything is very still, and I can hear my own breathing echoing strangely, like the room is much larger than it appears. The presence behind me is closer now, and I can feel its attention like heat on the back of my neck. I'm holding something in my hands. When I look down, it's the bookmark, but it's different somehow. Longer, maybe, or thicker. It pulses with the same rhythm as the electronic breathing, and I realize it's not just an object. It's a connection to something else, something that's been waiting patiently for me to remember. In the flash, I turn around. The memory cuts off there, but the feeling lingers. Whatever I saw when I turned around, it was familiar. Not frightening, not alien, but familiar in a way that makes my skin crawl when I think about it too hard. My apartment has been acting strange lately. Small things at first. The bathroom faucet turning on by itself, just a trickle that stops when I walk in to check. The refrigerator humming in a different key than usual. My reflection in the hallway mirror appearing a split second after I do, like it's catching up to me instead of moving with me. Last night I woke up to find every light in the apartment on, though I distinctly remembered turning them off. But they weren't casting light the way they should. The room was still dim, full of shadows that fell in the wrong directions. I walked through each room, turning off switches that clicked with a sound like small bones breaking. The bookmark was on my nightstand when I went back to bed, though I'd left it on the kitchen counter. It was warm to the touch and vibrating so subtly I might have imagined it. I had the third flash this morning while brushing my teeth. The green room again, but this time I'm not alone in it. There are others standing in a circle around something I can't quite see. They're perfectly still, heads tilted at the same angle, listening to something I can't hear. Their faces are calm, peaceful even, but wrong in a way I can't articulate. I'm part of the circle. I can feel the bookmark in my pocket, pulsing in time with whatever is in the center of the room. The electronic breathing sound is clearer now, almost like words, almost like instructions. One of the figures turns to look at me, and I recognize my own face, but the expression is different, content in a way I've never been, like I've finally found something I'd been searching for my whole life without knowing it. The flash ends when I realize I'm smiling the same smile in my bathroom mirror. I've been avoiding the recording, but it plays by itself sometimes. I'll be in another room and hear that familiar static drifting from my phone. When I check, the audio file is running, always starting from the 12-minute mark where the electronic breathing begins. The volume is never where I left it. It's always just loud enough to hear, like someone has adjusted it specifically for my ears. The bookmark has started changing shape, not dramatically, but enough that I notice. Sometimes it's slightly curved, sometimes perfectly straight. The ridges shift position, creating new patterns under my thumb. I've tried photographing it, but it always appears normal in pictures, just a black plastic bookmark, unremarkable and still. But in my hands, it feels alive. I found more notes today, dozens of them hidden in places I never would have thought to look. Inside the coffee canister, taped under the bathroom sink, folded between the pages of books I haven't touched in years. All in my handwriting, all saying things I don't remember thinking. The frequency is almost right. It's been waiting so patiently. I understand now why I had to forget. The bookmark isn't the key, it's the door. Reading them feels like eavesdropping on conversations I've had with myself, if I could split into two people and only remember being one of them. The most disturbing note was in my pillowcase, just a single line, "It's time to turn around again." The fourth flash lasted longer than the others. I was in the green room, but now I could see what was in the center of the circle. It wasn't a thing exactly. More like a space where something should be, but wasn't. The absence had weight and presence, and it was breathing with that electronic rhythm I'd been hearing in the recording. The other figures in the circle were all versions of myself, I realized. Different ages, different expressions, but unmistakably me. Some looked younger, some older. Some wore clothes I'd never owned. One had scars I'd never received. But they were all me, and they were all listening to the same instructions coming from the breathing absence in the center. I understood in the flash that this had happened before, many times. The forgetting, the finding, the slow reconstruction of memory. Each time I chose to forget again. Each time I left myself clues to find my way back when I was ready. The bookmark pulsed in my pocket, and I knew it was time to remember everything. But the flash ended before I could see what everything was. My reflection has been getting ahead of me. When I walk past mirrors now, it moves first, turning to look at me with eyes that hold knowledge I don't have yet. Sometimes it mouths words I can't hear, gestures toward things that aren't in my room. It's trying to tell me something, but we're separated by more than just glass. The electronic breathing has started happening outside the recording. I hear it in the walls at night, in the hum of the refrigerator, in the white noise of traffic outside my window. It's always at the edge of perception, just quiet enough that I might be imagining it. But the bookmark responds to it, growing warm and vibrating in whatever pocket I'm carrying it in. I think it's calling me back. The final flash came while I was holding the bookmark and listening to the recording at the same time. Everything aligned suddenly, like tumblers clicking into place in a lock I didn't know I'd been trying to open. I was in the green room, standing in the circle with all my other selves, but this time I could hear the instructions clearly. They weren't words exactly, but meanings that bypassed language and went straight into understanding. The breathing absence in the center wasn't empty at all. It was full of potential, of possibilities that existed in the spaces between thoughts. It had been waiting for me to be ready. Each cycle of forgetting and remembering was preparation, training me to hold larger and larger pieces of something too big for a single mind to contain. The bookmark wasn't just a connection. It was a piece of me, sent back from a version of myself that had already made the choice I was approaching. In the flash, I turned to face the center of the circle. The absence reached out with tendrils of concentrated possibility, and I understood that I could choose to remember everything, or I could choose to forget again and leave new clues for the next cycle. I had been choosing to forget because the everything was too much, too vast, too fundamentally different from what I thought existence should be. But each time I left the door open a little wider. Each time I prepared myself a little better for the choice. The flash ended, but the understanding remained. The bookmark in my hand was vibrating steadily now, no longer subtle. When I looked at it, I could see through it to something else, something that existed in the same space but in a different direction than the 3 dimensions I was used to. I can hear the electronic breathing clearly now. It's not coming from my phone or the walls or the air around me. It's coming from inside my own chest, where something has been waiting patiently for me to notice it. My reflection is smiling at me from the black screen of my phone, not my smile, but the smile I saw in the flash. Content, peaceful, ready. I think I know what the bookmark really is now. I think I know what choice I'm going to make this time. The recording is playing again, but I didn't start it. The static has cleared completely, and I can hear my own voice speaking words I haven't said yet, having a conversation with the breathing presence that lives in the spaces between my thoughts. The bookmark is warm in my palm, and when I close my eyes, I can see the green room waiting for me. All my other selves are there, standing in their circle, and there's an empty space where I belong. But there's something else now, something that wasn't there in the other flashes. Behind the circle, in the corners of the green room where the wrong-colored walls meet, there are shadows that move independently of the pulsing lights. They're watching the circle, watching me, and their attention feels different from the patient presence in the center. Hungry maybe, or jealous. I don't think I'm supposed to notice them. The bookmark is getting hot now, almost burning my palm, but I can't seem to let go of it. My reflection is mouthing words I can't hear, trying to warn me about something, but the electronic breathing is getting louder, drowning out everything else. I think I'm about to remember what I've been forgetting. I think I'm about to understand why I keep choosing to forget. But those shadows in the corners of the green room are moving closer, and I'm starting to wonder if the choice has ever really been mine at all. The recording has reached the end, but the electronic breathing continues. It's not coming from my phone anymore. It's coming from everywhere and nowhere, and it's asking me a question I don't want to understand. The bookmark is burning my palm now, but I still can't let go. When I look at it, I can see through it to the green room, to the circle of my other selves, to the breathing absence in the center. But I can also see the shadows moving closer, and I realize they have my face too. All of them. Every version of myself that chose to remember, that chose wrong, that let the everything fill them up until there was no room left for choice. I think the bookmark isn't just a door, I think it's a trap. But my hand is already moving toward my pocket, where my phone is recording a new audio file, where my voice is about to start speaking words I don't recognize, having a conversation with something that's been waiting so patiently for me to turn around again. The shadows are smiling now, and their smiles are exactly like mine. Story 3. It wasn't the first time the window was open in the morning. The curtains barely shifted, hanging more out of habit than function. A stray leaf lay on the floor, despite the room being sealed tight the night before. I swept it into the bin without a second thought. The air felt a touch cooler, but the thermostat showed no change. I straightened the cushions on the couch, noting the slight indentation in one of them. The remote control was exactly where it should have been, untouched since yesterday. When I left the room, I made sure to close the door softly. I didn't mind if it stayed ajar. Nothing unusual happened that night. I want to make that clear from the beginning. There was no event, no occurrence, no disturbance of any kind. I slept normally, woke up normally, and went about my morning routine exactly as I always do. The fact that I'm telling you this story doesn't mean anything significant took place. Sometimes we tell stories about ordinary nights, don't we? Sometimes the mundane becomes worth sharing simply because it reminds us how perfectly normal our lives really are. I went to bed at my usual time. The house was quiet, the way houses should be when everyone is settling in for the night. I brushed my teeth, changed into my pajamas, and pulled back the covers. The sheets were cool against my skin, which is exactly how I prefer them. I turned off the bedside lamp and closed my eyes. Sleep came easily, the way it does when your mind is clear and untroubled. There was no sound from outside, no car engines, no footsteps on the sidewalk, no voices carrying through the darkness. The silence was complete and natural. If I happened to notice how deliberately quiet it seemed, that was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Sometimes silence can feel heavy, can't it? But that doesn't mean anything is wrong. It just means the world is resting the way it should. I didn't see any lights through my bedroom window. The street lamp outside had been broken for weeks, leaving that section of the block in comfortable darkness. If there had been any illumination, any glow that seemed to pulse with a rhythm I couldn't quite identify, it would have been nothing more than a reflection from somewhere else. Maybe a neighbor's television flickering, or headlights from a distant road catching the glass at an odd angle. Light behaves strangely sometimes, bending and shifting in ways that can fool the eye. The temperature in my bedroom remained constant throughout the night. I keep a digital display on my nightstand that shows both the time and the room temperature, and it never wavered from its usual reading. If I felt a sudden chill around what might have been midnight, it was probably just a draft from the air conditioning. Old houses settle and shift, creating small gaps that let the cool air seep through. There's nothing unusual about feeling cold in the middle of the night, even during the warmer months. I certainly didn't hear any humming. There was no low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. No frequency that made my teeth ache and my bones feel loose in their joints. The house was silent, as I've already mentioned. If something that sounded like machinery or electronics seemed to fill the air around me, it must have been the refrigerator cycling on, or maybe the neighbor's pool pump running its nightly cycle. These sounds can carry further than we expect, especially when everything else is quiet. My bedroom door stayed closed all night. I always make sure to latch it properly before getting into bed. It's a habit I developed years ago, something about feeling secure and private in my own space. The door didn't swing open on its own. It didn't reveal a hallway that seemed longer than it should have been, stretching away into darkness that felt thick and substantial. I didn't see anything moving in that darkness. No shapes that might have been shadows but seemed too purposeful, too aware of my presence. I remained in my bed from the moment I lay down until my alarm went off in the morning. I didn't get up to investigate anything. I didn't walk barefoot across the cold hardwood floor, following a sound that might have been my name being called softly from somewhere deeper in the house. My feet never touched that floor in the middle of the night. They never registered how unusually cold the wood felt, almost metallic, as if it had been storing some deep chill that had nothing to do with the season or the thermostat setting. There was no hallway to walk down. Well, of course there was a hallway, this is my house after all, but I mean there was nothing unusual about it. It didn't seem to extend further than normal, with doors I didn't remember being there before. The walls didn't have that strange texture, like they were breathing very slowly, expanding and contracting just enough to notice if you were paying attention. The carpet runner didn't feel damp under my feet, even though the house had been dry when I went to bed, and there was no reason for moisture to appear overnight. I never reached the living room. Since I never left my bedroom, how could I have ended up in the living room? But if I had walked there, if I had found myself standing in the doorway looking into that familiar space, I wouldn't have seen anything out of place. The The furniture would have been exactly where it belonged. The couch wouldn't have had three distinct impressions in the cushions, as if people had been sitting there having a quiet conversation. The coffee table wouldn't have shown those faint circular marks, like glasses had been set down and left for hours, even though I don't remember having anyone over recently. The television wasn't on. It couldn't have been on because the power had gone out sometime after I fell asleep. Not a complete outage, you understand, just enough of a disruption to reset all the clocks and make the digital displays blink that annoying 1200 until someone manually resets them. But even if the television had been on, it wouldn't have been showing anything unusual. Just static, maybe, or that blue screen that appears when there's no signal. Certainly not images that moved too smoothly, like they were being projected rather than broadcast. I didn't sit down on the couch. I wasn't drawn to take a seat in the middle cushion, the one that seemed to have been warmed by someone else's presence just moments before I arrived. I didn't sink into that warmth and feel how perfectly it matched my own body temperature, as if it had been waiting specifically for me. My hands didn't rest on the armrests and notice how the fabric felt different, softer somehow, like it had been worn smooth by years of use, even though I'd only bought the couch last spring. There were no voices coming from the kitchen. The sound that might have been conversation was probably just the ice maker in the refrigerator going through its cycle. These appliances make all sorts of noises during the night, clicks and hums and settling sounds that can seem almost like speech if you're tired enough. If I thought I heard my own name mentioned, followed by what sounded like gentle laughter, it was just my mind trying to make sense of random mechanical noise. Our brains are always looking for patterns, even when there aren't any to find. I never walked toward the kitchen. My feet never carried me across the living room carpet and onto the cold tile floor. I never noticed how the tile felt different than usual, slightly textured, as if it had been covered with a thin layer of something I couldn't identify. The kitchen lights weren't on, casting everything in that bright, clinical glow that makes familiar objects look strange and unfamiliar. I didn't see the chairs pulled out from the dining table, arranged as if people had just finished eating and stepped away for a moment. The back door was locked just as I'd left it before going to bed. I always check the locks before turning in for the night. It's part of my routine. The door didn't stand slightly ajar, letting in a breeze that carried scents I couldn't place. Not exactly metallic, not exactly organic, but something that made me think of deep places where air doesn't circulate often. The screen door wasn't moving gently back and forth, as if someone had just passed through it and it hadn't quite settled back into place yet. I didn't step outside. Why would I step outside in the middle of the night? That would be foolish and unnecessary. But if I had stepped onto the back porch, if I had felt the cool night air against my skin, I wouldn't have noticed anything different about my backyard. The grass would have looked normal, not pressed down in several places as if heavy objects had been resting on it. The flower beds would have been undisturbed, showing no signs of having been recently examined or sampled. The sky was perfectly ordinary that night. Stars in their usual positions, moon showing whatever phase it happened to be in, nothing remarkable at all. If there had been lights moving among the stars, they would have been airplanes or satellites, nothing more exotic than that. The way they seemed to move in formation, stopping and starting with a precision that felt intentional, that was just a trick of perspective. Objects at great distances can appear to behave strangely when you're watching them from ground level. I never looked up at those lights for an extended period. I never stood in my backyard with my head tilted back, watching patterns of movement that seemed to respond to my attention. When I focused on one particular light, it didn't grow brighter, and it certainly didn't begin to descend toward my location. The humming sound I mentioned earlier, the one that definitely didn't happen, wouldn't have grown stronger as the light approached. My skin wouldn't have started to tingle, like the air around me was becoming charged with some kind of energy. The light never reached ground level. There was no moment when I found myself standing in a pool of illumination that felt warm against my skin but cast no shadows. I didn't look around and see my familiar backyard rendered strange and colorless by this impossible light. The trees didn't look like they were made of glass, their leaves transparent and delicate. The fence didn't seem to extend much higher than I remembered, reaching up into darkness that the light couldn't penetrate. I was never not alone in that light. The shapes that might have been standing at the edges of my vision were just trees and bushes, distorted by the unusual illumination. They weren't tall and thin, and they certainly weren't moving closer with a patience that felt practiced, rehearsed. If I had the impression that they were observing me, studying my reactions to their presence, it was just my imagination trying to make sense of an ordinary situation. Nothing touched me. I need to be very clear about that. At no point during this night that I'm not describing did anything make physical contact with my body. I didn't feel those long, cool fingers against my arm, guiding me gently but firmly toward a direction I wouldn't have chosen myself. The touch wasn't surprisingly gentle, considering how strange the fingers felt. They weren't exactly soft and weren't exactly hard, but something in between that my mind couldn't quite categorize. I never walked anywhere under that guidance. My feet stayed firmly planted in my own backyard, on ground I'd walked across hundreds of times before. I wasn't led toward a section of my property that I rarely visited, the area behind the garden shed where the previous owners had left some old concrete slabs. Those slabs weren't glowing with their own faint light, and they certainly weren't warm to the touch despite the cool night air. There was no opening in the ground. The concrete slabs weren't covering anything, and they definitely weren't sliding aside with a smooth, mechanical precision that suggested they'd been designed to move. I didn't see the space beneath them, that perfectly round tunnel that descended at a gentle angle into the earth. The walls of this tunnel that didn't exist weren't lined with some kind of smooth material that reflected the light in a way that made it impossible to judge distances. I never descended into that tunnel. How could I when it wasn't there in the first place? But if I had walked down that gently sloping passage, if I had felt the walls growing warmer as I went deeper, I wouldn't have been surprised by how comfortable the temperature became. The air wouldn't have felt cleaner somehow, filtered and pure in a way that made each breath more satisfying than the last. My bare feet wouldn't have noticed how the floor seemed to adapt to each step, providing exactly the right amount of support and cushioning. The tunnel didn't open into a larger space. There was no chamber carved from the earth beneath my property, no room with walls that curved smoothly upward to meet in a dome overhead. The surfaces weren't covered with that same reflective material, creating an environment that felt both enclosed and limitless. I didn't stand in the center of this space and slowly turn in a circle, trying to understand the geometry of what I was seeing. There were no others waiting for me there. The figures arranged around the perimeter of the room were just my imagination, just the way shadows and light can create the illusion of presence when there's nothing really there. They weren't seated in chairs that seemed to have grown from the floor itself, organic and artificial at the same time. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but that was because there were no faces to see, no expressions of patient interest in something that might have been fondness. They never spoke to me. There was no moment when one of them rose from their chair and approached me with movements that were too fluid, too graceful for anything I was familiar with. No words were exchanged, no explanations offered for why I was there or what was expected of me. I didn't hear my own voice responding to questions I don't remember being asked, giving answers that seemed to come from some part of my mind I wasn't consciously controlling. The examination never took place. I never found myself lying on a surface that appeared when I needed it, supporting my body with that same adaptive quality I'd noticed in the tunnel floor. There were no instruments, no devices that hummed with quiet efficiency while they performed functions I couldn't identify. The beings around me didn't work with a coordination that suggested they'd done this many times before, each knowing their role in a process I was only beginning to understand. I felt no discomfort during the examination that didn't happen. Whatever they were doing, and they weren't doing anything because none of this occurred, it was conducted with a care that surprised me. When they needed to move my arms or legs, the touch was gentle and respectful. When they examined areas of my body that should have made me feel vulnerable or violated, their manner remained clinical and somehow reassuring. I got the impression that my well-being was important to them, that they took no pleasure in any distress I might have felt. The process wasn't lengthy, but it felt thorough. They seemed to be gathering information, taking measurements or samples that wouldn't leave any trace of their work. I understood somehow that this was routine for them, that they'd performed similar examinations countless times before. But I also sensed that each subject was treated as an individual, that they were learning something specific about me that they couldn't learn from anyone else. When they finished, I wasn't helped to my feet and guided toward another area of the chamber. There was no second room, smaller and more intimate than the first, with seating arranged to facilitate conversation. I never sat across from one of them, the one who seemed to be their spokesperson, and engaged in a discussion about things I'd never considered before. We didn't talk about the nature of existence, about the connections between all living things, about responsibilities and purposes that extend beyond individual concerns. I never learned about their interest in our species. They never explained how long they'd been observing us, how many of us they'd encountered over the years. I didn't hear about the careful balance they maintained, the need to gather information without disrupting the natural development of our society. They never described the selection process, the criteria they used to choose individuals for these encounters, or why I had been deemed suitable for their purposes. The conversation never turned to the future, to the changes that were coming, whether we were prepared for them or not. They didn't express concern about our ability to adapt, about the choices we would need to make as a species in the coming years. I never got the sense that they were trying to help us in their own way to prepare for challenges we couldn't yet imagine. There was no feeling that this encounter was part of something larger, a process that had been unfolding for generations and would continue long after I was gone. When our discussion ended, they didn't escort me back through the chamber and into the tunnel. I never walked up that sloping passage with one of them beside me, their presence somehow comforting as we returned to the surface. The concrete slabs didn't slide back into place behind us, sealing the entrance as if it had never been disturbed. I never stood once again in my backyard, watching as my guide rejoined the others who had been waiting in the shadows. The lights in the sky didn't fade gradually, becoming indistinguishable from the stars before disappearing entirely. The humming sound didn't diminish slowly, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the one that had preceded it. I never walked back across my yard, back through the kitchen and living room, back down the hallway to my bedroom. My feet never registered how normal the floors felt again, how familiar and solid after the adaptive surfaces I'd experienced below ground. I never climbed back into my bed and pulled the covers up to my chin. I never lay there in the darkness, processing what had happened, trying to understand how my perception of the world had changed in the course of a single night. Sleep didn't come easily this time. I never spent the remaining hours before dawn replaying every moment of the encounter, examining each detail to make sure I would remember it accurately. When morning came, I woke up in my bed exactly as I do every day. The alarm went off at its usual time, and I followed my normal routine. Shower, coffee, breakfast, the small domestic rituals that structure the beginning of each day. Everything was perfectly ordinary, perfectly normal. The fact that I felt different somehow, that the world seemed both exactly the same and fundamentally changed, was probably just the result of an unusually vivid dream. I didn't find any physical evidence of what hadn't occurred. There were no marks on my body, no tender spots that suggested I'd been examined by unfamiliar hands. My clothes were exactly where I'd left them, showing no signs of having been removed and replaced. The backyard looked normal when I glanced out the kitchen window, the grass showing no unusual patterns, the concrete slabs behind the shed sitting exactly where they'd always been. But I did notice that I felt different as I went through my morning routine, more aware somehow of the connections between things. The way the sunlight fell across the kitchen counter seemed more significant than it had before. The sound of birds in the trees carried meanings I couldn't quite articulate. When I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I saw the same face I'd always seen, but there was something in my eyes that hadn't been there before, a knowledge that felt both precious and burdensome. I went to work that day and performed my duties exactly as I always did. I spoke to my colleagues, attended meetings, completed tasks, and responded to emails. No one commented that I seemed different or distracted. If I found myself staring out the window more often than usual, thinking about vast distances and the patient intelligence that might be observing us from those distances, no one seemed to notice. I was careful to maintain my normal demeanor, to give no indication that anything had changed. The days that followed were similarly ordinary. I maintained my routines, fulfilled my responsibilities, and interacted with others exactly as I always had. But I found myself paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. The way shadows fell at certain times of day, the patterns that birds made when they flew in formation, the quality of silence that settled over the neighborhood late at night. I began to understand that the world was full of signs and signals that most of us simply didn't know how to read. I never felt lonely after that night. Even when I was by myself, I had the sense that I was being observed, not in a threatening way, but with the same patient interest I'd encountered in that chamber that didn't exist. I began to think of myself as part of something larger, connected to a network of awareness that extended far beyond my individual experience. This feeling brought me comfort during difficult moments and added depth to moments of joy. Sometimes I would stand in my backyard at night, looking up at the stars and wondering which of them might be home to my visitors. I never saw the lights moving among them again, but I felt confident that they were still there, still watching, still gathering the information they needed for purposes I could only guess at. I found myself hoping that I had been helpful to them, that the data they'd collected from my examination would contribute to their understanding of our species. I never spoke to anyone about what hadn't happened that night, who would believe such a story, and more importantly, I had the sense that discretion was expected, that the success of their mission depended partly on the silence of those they encountered. I felt honored to have been chosen, to have been deemed trustworthy enough to participate in something so significant. The secret became a source of quiet pride, a knowledge that set me apart in ways that no one else could detect. My life continued normally, but with an underlying awareness that change was coming. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually and inevitably. I began to pay more attention to news about scientific discoveries, about advances in technology, about the ways our understanding of the universe was expanding. I found myself wondering if some of these developments were influenced by information gathered during encounters like mine, if the visitors were subtly guiding our progress towards some greater understanding. I sleep well now, better than I had in years. My dreams are vivid and complex, filled with images of distant worlds and civilizations I've never seen but somehow recognize. Sometimes I wake with the feeling that I've been traveling, that my consciousness has been elsewhere while my body rested. These dreams don't disturb me. Instead, they feel like gifts, glimpses of possibilities that await our species if we prove worthy of them. The window in my living room is often open in the morning now, though I don't remember opening it. The curtains move gently in breezes that don't seem to affect anything else in the room. I find leaves on the floor that couldn't have blown in from outside, leaves from trees that don't grow in this climate. I collect them carefully and press them between the pages of books, though I'm not sure why this seems important. My neighbors have begun to comment on how peaceful I seem, how centered. They ask if I've been meditating or practicing some new form of self-care. I smile and tell them I've just been sleeping better, which is true enough. I don't mention the sense of purpose that has settled over my life, the feeling that I'm waiting for something wonderful and inevitable to unfold. They wouldn't understand, and there's no need to burden them with questions they're not ready to ask. Nothing unusual happened that night. I want to end where I began, with that simple truth. My life continues exactly as it always has, filled with the same routines and responsibilities, the same small pleasures and minor frustrations that define ordinary human existence. If I seem more patient now, more willing to wait for developments that others can't yet imagine, that's simply a sign of growing maturity and wisdom. The fact that I check the backyard every night before bed, that I've begun leaving the kitchen door unlocked, that I've cleared away the garden tools that used to clutter the area around those concrete slabs, these are just minor adjustments to my routine. We all make small changes as we grow older, as our priorities shift and our understanding deepens. There's nothing significant about any of it. Tonight will be like any other night. I'll follow my usual routine, turn off the lights, and settle into bed with a clear conscience and a peaceful mind. If I find myself listening more carefully to the silence outside my window, if I notice the quality of darkness seems different somehow, more expectant, that's just my imagination playing tricks on me. Sometimes the night feels full of possibility, doesn't it? Sometimes we sense that change is coming, even when everything appears perfectly normal. I think they might be coming back soon. Story 4. The initial inventory inspection commenced at 1800 hours. Rows of identical boxes lined the shelves, each barcode meticulously recorded. Scanning devices showed all items present and accounted for according to the digital ledger. Temperature controls remained constant, unwavering between documented check-ins. Dust gathered in corners, undisturbed by recent movements. An unopened delivery sat inconspicuously by the entrance, logged but lacking a corresponding dispatch record. All lights functioned properly, though the power indicator flickered irregularly. Exit routes were unobstructed, yet the motion sensors failed to register any activity. The air vent emitted a low hum, yet the security footage looped back 2 minutes. I still hear that humming, it never stopped, not really. Even now, sitting here trying to explain what happened to me, the sound follows me like a shadow I can't shake. My refrigerator makes it sometimes, that same low drone that seems to come from somewhere deeper than the machinery itself. When it starts, I have to leave the room. I have to go outside and breathe until my hands stop trembling. The sleep hasn't returned. 3 weeks now, maybe 4, I've lost count. I catch myself staring at the ceiling, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. My neighbors think I've lost my mind. They see me checking the locks on my windows at all hours, testing the motion sensors I installed around my apartment. The devices worked perfectly, but they didn't work that night. They didn't register what was moving through that place. My phone still glitches. The screen flickers with static patterns that remind me of interference, like when you're too close to something powerful that disrupts the signal. The repair shop said there's nothing wrong with it, that the circuits are fine, but I know better. I've seen what that kind of distortion looks like when something is watching, when something is scanning. The dreams are the worst part. I see myself standing in that storage facility again, surrounded by those endless rows of boxes, but in the dream I can see what's inside them. They're empty, all of them, and I realize they were never meant to hold inventory at all. They were meant to hold something else, something that needed containment. The scanning device in my hand shows readings that make no sense, numbers that climb higher and higher until the screen goes white with light. I wake up tasting metal in my mouth, that sharp tang of ozone that clings to the back of my throat. It's the same taste I had for days after that shift, the one that made me brush my teeth until my gums bled but never went away. The doctors said it was stress, maybe a vitamin deficiency, but I know what I tasted. I know what that metallic flavor means. The memory comes back in pieces, fragments that don't want to fit together. I remember standing in the center of that facility, my scanning device dead in my hands, all the lights functioning perfectly except for that power indicator that kept flickering in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. The temperature controls showed normal readings, but I was shivering. The air felt charged, like the moments before lightning strikes. That's when I saw it, not clearly, not all at once, but enough to know that something was there with me among those shelves. A shape that didn't belong, moving with purpose between the rows of boxes. It didn't make sound when it walked, didn't disturb the dust that had settled in those corners. But I felt it watching me, studying me, recording me just like I was supposed to be recording that inventory. The security footage should have captured everything. Hours of tape, multiple angles, motion sensors that tracked every movement in that facility. But when they reviewed it later, when I tried to explain what happened, there was nothing. Just me standing alone in that space, scanning empty air while the cameras rolled. 2 minutes of footage, looping endlessly, showing a person who looked like they were responding to something that wasn't there. But I know what I saw. I know what stood at the end of that corridor, tall and silent, observing me with an intelligence that felt ancient and patient. It didn't move like a person. It moved like something that understood the space better than I did, something that belonged there more than I ever could. The humming had been going on for hours before I saw it, that low, constant drone from the air vents that seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I thought it was normal at first, just the sound of ventilation systems working through the night shift, but as the hours passed, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the vents at all. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the building. The boxes were wrong too, though I didn't understand it then. Each one was identical, perfectly aligned on those metal shelves, but they felt hollow when I passed them. Not empty hollow, but hollow in a way that suggested they were waiting to be filled. The barcodes scanned properly, the digital ledger showed everything in order, but my hands kept shaking when I held the scanner. The device grew warm against my palm, warmer than it should have from simple use. I remember checking that unopened delivery by the entrance multiple times. It sat there like it had always been there, but the shipping label was blank except for a tracking number that didn't match any system I recognized. When I tried to scan it, the device made a sound I'd never heard before, a high whine that made my teeth ache. I left it alone after that, but I could feel it behind me as I worked, like it was watching. The power indicator kept flickering, not randomly, but in sequences that seemed to follow a pattern. 3 short flashes, then 2 long ones, then a pause before it started again. I found myself counting along with it, anticipating the rhythm until I realized I was holding my breath between cycles. The lights themselves never dimmed, never failed, but that indicator pulsed like a beacon sending signals to something outside. The motion sensors should have been tracking me constantly as I moved through the facility. Every step, every turn, every pause to scan inventory should have been recorded and logged, but when I checked the readouts, they showed nothing. According to the sensors, the building was empty, had been empty all night. Yet I was there, moving through those corridors, and I wasn't alone. The temperature began to shift sometime before I saw the figure. Subtle at first, just a coolness that crept along the floor and wrapped around my ankles. The control systems showed steady readings, perfect climate management, but I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. The cold seemed to follow me, staying just close enough to remind me that something was changing in that space. That's when the scanning device started showing readings that made no sense. Items that weren't there according to the digital ledger, inventory counts that shifted every time I looked away and looked back. The screen flickered with symbols I didn't recognize, patterns that hurt to look at directly. I thought the device was malfunctioning, but now I understand it was detecting something I couldn't see. The facility had been quiet when I arrived, peaceful even. Just another routine inventory check, another night shift in a place where nothing ever happened. The delivery truck had come and gone, leaving that unmarked package by the entrance. The previous shift had signed off without incident, all systems normal, all counts accurate. I remember the moment I unlocked the doors and stepped inside. The air smelled clean, sterile, with just the faintest hint of ozone that I attributed to the electronic systems. The lights came on automatically as I entered, illuminating row after row of perfectly organized inventory. Everything was exactly where it should be, exactly as it had been documented. The scanning device powered up normally, its screen bright and responsive in my hands. The digital ledger loaded without error, showing hundreds of items to be verified and recorded. I had done this same job dozens of times before, in facilities just like this one. There was no reason to expect anything different. But even then, in those first moments of what should have been an ordinary shift, something was already watching. Something had already been waiting in that place, patient and still, for someone like me to arrive. The humming was already there, so quiet I barely noticed it. The power indicator was already beginning its strange rhythm. The motion sensors were already failing to see what moved through those corridors. I just didn't know it yet. None of us ever do, until it's too late to turn around and walk away. Until the doors close behind us, and we realize that some inventories are meant to catalog more than boxes on shelves. Some places are designed to take inventory of us instead, to scan and record and file away everything we are for purposes we'll never understand. And somewhere in a facility that looks just like the one I left that night, the humming continues. The power indicator still flickers its patient signal. The motion sensors still fail to register what walks between those shelves, waiting for the next person to unlock those doors and step inside, scanning device in hand, ready to discover what kinds of things can't be captured on security footage, but never really leave you alone. Story 5. I brushed the thin layer of dust from the tabletop and felt a chill run through my fingers. Each particle seemed to clamor for attention, betraying a presence that shouldn't have been. The creak of the wooden floor beneath me was only a shadow in my peripheral awareness. My skin rose with goosebumps as if the room exhaled a secret. The air tasted older, more muted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the dust carried stories I wasn't meant to hear. That's where it starts, where everything starts, I think, but I'm not sure anymore. The memories come in pieces, like broken glass scattered across a dark floor, and when I try to gather them, they cut. Some shine bright and sharp, others are clouded, warped by something I can't name. I've been trying to remember what happened. The doctors say trauma does this, fragments things, makes time fold in on itself. But they don't understand. They see the surface wounds, the obvious damage. They don't see how the air itself feels different now, how sounds carry weight they shouldn't carry. There's a hum, always a hum. It starts low, somewhere behind my ribs, and spreads outward until I can't tell if it's coming from inside me or from the walls themselves. Sometimes I wake up and it's there, waiting. Sometimes it builds slowly through the day until I have to press my palms against my ears just to think. The room, I keep coming back to the room. Wooden floors, dust on everything, but not the kind of dust that settles naturally. This dust had purpose. It arranged itself in patterns I almost recognized, spirals and lines that made my vision blur when I looked too long. The tabletop was cold under my fingertips, colder than it should have been. But before that there was walking, long corridors that stretched further than they had any right to. My footsteps echoed wrong, came back to me changed, as if the sound had been filtered through something dense and organic. The walls were painted a color I can't describe, not quite green, not quite gray. The color of old water, maybe, the color of holding your breath too long. I remember touching my arm and feeling surprised by the warmth of my own skin. Why surprised? That detail sticks with me, sharp and inexplicable. My skin felt foreign, like I was borrowing it from someone else. The sensation of my pulse under my fingertips was too loud, too insistent. There was a door, has to have been a door, because I remember the light seeping underneath it, not regular light. This light moved, pulsed with a rhythm that matched something I felt in my chest. I stood outside that door for what felt like hours or maybe minutes. Time wasn't behaving properly. My hand hovered over the handle and I could feel heat radiating through the metal, up my arm, settling in the base of my skull. Did I open it? The memory fractures here, splits into possibilities. In one version, I turn the handle and step into brightness so complete it erases everything that comes after. In another, I never touch the door at all, just stand there until my legs give out and I sink to the floor, watching that impossible light dance beneath the gap. The smell comes back to me in waves, metallic, sharp, like copper pennies held too long in a sweaty palm. But underneath that, something organic. Something that reminded me of the way air tastes right before a storm, electric and heavy with potential. It clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. I could taste it for days afterward. Days afterward, so there was an afterward, that something at least. I keep trying to piece together the sequence. The room with the dust came first, I think, or maybe it came last. Maybe I'm remembering it backwards, the way you sometimes dream in reverse, starting with the ending and working toward the beginning until nothing makes sense anymore. There was a figure standing so still I almost mistook it for furniture, for a coat rack or a tall lamp. But furniture doesn't breathe, and this thing breathed. Slow, deliberate breaths that seemed to pull the air out of the room with each inhalation. I couldn't see its face. Every time I tried to focus, my eyes would slide away, like trying to look directly at the sun. The figure was important. I know this the way you know you're dreaming even while the dream continues. It was the center of everything, the point around which all the other fragments orbit. But when I try to remember what it said, what it did, the memory turns to static in my head. Static, that's another sound that follows me. Not the clean white noise of a television between channels, but something messier, more organic. Like the sound of insects in tall grass or rain on leaves, but processed through something that shouldn't be processing sound at all. My hands shake when I think about this too long. Physical response to mental reconstruction. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe my mind is trying to protect my body from something it can't handle. There were others, had to be others, because I remember the feeling of being watched by more than one set of eyes. The weight of multiple gazes pressing against my skin like warm hands. But when I turned to look, I only ever saw the one figure, motionless and breathing. The vibration in the floor. How could I forget the vibration? It started as a tremor, barely perceptible, like a train passing far underground, but it grew stronger, more rhythmic, until I could feel it in my teeth, my bones. The wooden floorboards groaned with each pulse, and dust shook loose from the ceiling in little cascades that caught the strange light and held it. I was afraid, that much is clear. Fear so pure and immediate it bypassed thought entirely, went straight to my nervous system and lit it up like a circuit board. But afraid of what? The figure, the light, the sound that wasn't quite sound that seemed to be calling my name. My name, someone was calling my name, but the voice was wrong, too deep or too high or coming from the wrong direction, coming from inside my own head maybe. I answered, I think. Opened my mouth and heard my voice echo back to me from impossible distances. The air grew thick, viscous almost, like breathing through honey or blood or some other fluid that shouldn't exist in gaseous form. Each breath became an effort, a conscious decision to continue living. My lungs worked harder, my heart raced to compensate, and still I felt like I was suffocating on nothing. Time moved wrong, I keep coming back to this. Minutes stretched into hours, hours compressed into seconds. I watched dust motes drift through the air and each particle seemed to take forever to fall, but when I looked at my hands I could see them aging in real time, skin tightening, veins becoming more prominent. The temperature fluctuated wildly. One moment I was shivering, breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. The next I was sweating through my clothes, skin slick and hypersensitive. The changes happened without warning, without apparent cause. The room itself seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting with each shift in climate. I touched the walls. Why did I touch the walls? The surface felt wrong under my palms, too soft, too warm, like skin stretched over something that wasn't quite the right shape. I could feel movement underneath, slow and rhythmic, circulation maybe, or digestion. The light behind the door grew brighter. I'm sure of this, even though I can't be sure of anything else. It pulsed faster, more urgently, and I could hear something like music coming from the other side. Not music, exactly. Organized sound. Patterns within patterns, harmonics that made my skull ache and my vision blur. I was crying. When did I start crying? The tears felt hot against my cheeks, hotter than they should have been. They left tracks through the dust that had somehow accumulated on my face, and when they hit the floor, they sizzled. The figure moved. Finally, after what felt like hours of perfect stillness, it shifted. Just slightly, just enough to let me know it was aware of me. The movement was wrong, too fluid, like something without joints or bones. It turned toward me and I still couldn't see its face, but I could feel its attention like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I ran or tried to run. My legs felt heavy, uncooperative, like moving through deep water. The corridors stretched ahead of me, longer than before, and my footsteps echoed back with that same wrongness, that same sense of being filtered through something organic and alive. The hum grew louder. It filled my head, my chest, my entire body until I was nothing but vibration, nothing but sound given temporary form. I could feel my thoughts dissolving into the frequency, my sense of self becoming part of something larger and more terrible. And then silence. Complete, absolute silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of its opposite, anti-sound. It pressed against my eardrums, made my head feel like it was going to implode. I opened my mouth to scream and heard nothing, felt nothing but the movement of air across my vocal cords. The dust settled, everything stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped existing except in the most basic sense. I stood in the middle of it all, the only thing still alive in a world that had forgotten how to live. But I escaped, somehow I escaped. I'm here now, writing this, speaking this, trying to make sense of fragments that resist sense. The doctors say I was found 3 blocks from my apartment, unconscious, no signs of physical trauma except for the dust under my fingernails and the taste of copper in my mouth that lasted for weeks. They say I was only missing for 6 hours, but I remember days, weeks, lifetimes of walking those corridors, standing before that door, feeling that presence watching me with eyes I couldn't see. The dreams are getting stronger, more vivid, more complete. Sometimes I wake up and find dust on my sheets, dust that arranges itself in those same spirals and lines. Sometimes I hear the hum in the walls of my apartment, feel the floor vibrating beneath my feet. Sometimes I catch myself walking toward doors that pulse with light I shouldn't be able to see. The figure is still there in the dreams, still breathing, still watching, still waiting for me to remember what I'm not supposed to remember, what my mind has hidden from itself for its own protection. But the protection is failing. The memories are surfacing, becoming whole, and I'm beginning to understand that what happened to me in that place wasn't an ending. It was an invitation. And I think I'm finally ready to accept it. Story 6. The weight of what remains. There was a time when I dismissed it as mere coincidence, something that existed in the periphery of my daily routine. Every morning while sipping my coffee, I'd notice a pair of shoes left outside the neighboring door, the same pair, side by side, always facing the same direction. Yet one day the left shoe was inexplicably turned at an angle. I shrugged it off at first, until it happened again, the same shoe, now slightly scuffed. Yesterday I noticed a new pair, but only one shoe was there. The other had vanished, leaving behind a hint of unease I can't quite shake. That's how it started, you see, with shoes, with small things that felt wrong but not wrong enough to matter. Not until much later, when I understood that some details aren't coincidences at all, their warnings were too stubborn to hear. I've never told anyone about what happened afterward, not the full truth anyway. For years I've carried it like a stone in my chest, heavy and cold, growing heavier with each passing season. People ask me why I moved so far away, why I left everything behind so suddenly. I tell them I needed a change, needed space to breathe. They nod and accept this because it sounds reasonable, because it fits the narrative of someone seeking a fresh start. But that's not why I left. I left because staying meant accepting that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And I left because I realized that running away doesn't always mean you escape what's chasing you. Sometimes it just means you carry it with you to new places, like a shadow that's learned to exist without light. I'm ready now, I think, to speak about it. My hands shake as I say this, even though I'm alone in this small apartment, thousands of miles from where it happened. The distance should feel like safety. Most days it does. But on nights like this, when the air grows thick and still, I remember that some things don't respect geography. Before everything changed, my life was beautifully ordinary. I had a routine that felt solid, predictable. I lived in a small house on the edge of town, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's schedules and the mailman always waved. The house came furnished, which suited me perfectly. I wasn't much for decorating, and the previous tenant had left behind everything I needed. Simple furniture, a few paintings on the walls, even some books on the shelves that I'd grown fond of reading. I worked from home, which meant my world had comfortable boundaries. My office faced the backyard, where a single oak tree cast shifting shadows across the grass throughout the day. I'd watch those shadows move like a slow clock, marking time in a way that felt natural, unhurried. In the evenings, I'd sit on the back porch with a cup of tea, listening to the neighborhood settle into night. Dogs barking in the distance, the hum of air conditioners, the occasional car passing on the street out front. It was peaceful, more peaceful than I'd ever expected life to be. The house had its quirks, of course. Old places always do. The floorboards in the hallway creaked in a specific pattern that I learned to navigate around. The bathroom light flickered for a few seconds before staying on. The kitchen faucet dripped at a steady rhythm that became almost meditative after a while. These weren't problems, they were personality traits, the kind of small imperfections that make a place feel lived in rather than sterile. I should have paid more attention to the basement door. It was painted the same white as all the other doors, but something about it felt different from the start. Heavier maybe, or maybe it was just that I never had any reason to open it. The landlord had mentioned that the basement was mostly storage space, filled with things the previous tenant had left behind. Since I had everything I needed upstairs, I saw no point in exploring down there. But doors have a way of demanding attention, even when you're trying to ignore them. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was working late in my office. It was one of those nights when time seems to dissolve, when you look up from your computer screen and realize hours have passed without you noticing. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the oak tree's branches brushing against the roof when the wind picked up. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was subtle at first, like a distant radio playing between stations. That soft hiss of static, punctuated by what might have been voices or might have been nothing at all. I paused my typing and listened more carefully, trying to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from somewhere inside the walls, as if the house itself had developed a frequency I'd never noticed before. I told myself it was probably interference from a neighbor's electronics, or maybe the old wiring picking up signals from somewhere. Old houses do that sometimes. I'd lived in places before where you could hear fragments of radio broadcasts bleeding through the electrical system, phantom voices speaking words that made no sense out of context. But this felt different, more intentional. I saved my work and walked through the house, following the sound. It was stronger in the hallway near the basement door. I pressed my ear against the wood and listened. The static was definitely coming from down there, along with something else, a low hum that seemed to pulse in a rhythm I couldn't quite identify. My hand was on the doorknob before I realized what I was doing. The metal was cold, colder than it should have been on a warm evening. I turned it slowly, expecting resistance, but the door opened easily, too easily, as if it had been waiting. The basement stairs descended into darkness. I fumbled for a light switch and found one just inside the doorframe. When I flipped it, a single bulb illuminated the space below concrete walls, wooden shelves lined with boxes and old furniture, the typical detritus of lives lived and moved on from. The sound was clearer now. It was coming from an old radio sitting on one of the shelves, its antenna extended, its dial glowing faintly amber. I hadn't turned it on, I was certain of that. But there it was, broadcasting its strange signal into the empty air. I walked down the stairs, each step echoing in the confined space. The radio was an old model, the kind with actual dials and knobs, probably from decades ago. Its speaker crackled with that same static I'd heard upstairs, but now I could make out something underneath the noise. Not voices exactly, but patterns. Rhythms that almost sounded like speech, like someone trying to communicate through interference. I reached for the power knob and turned it off. The sound died immediately, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. I stood there for a moment, studying the radio, trying to understand how it had turned itself on. Maybe the wiring was faulty. Maybe it was picking up signals even when it was supposed to be off. I unplugged it from the wall outlet and headed back upstairs, feeling oddly unsettled. It wasn't until I was back in my office, trying to return to work, that I realized something else was wrong. The smell. It had started while I was in the basement, but I'd been too focused on the radio to notice it right away. Now it was stronger, drifting up through the house like invisible smoke, sweet and metallic at the same time, like copper pennies mixed with overripe fruit. It made my stomach turn in a way that felt instinctive, primal, as if my body recognized a danger my mind hadn't identified yet. I checked the kitchen, thinking maybe something had spoiled in the refrigerator. Nothing. The bathroom, in case there was a plumbing issue. Nothing there either. The smell seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, diffuse and elusive, growing stronger whenever I tried to pin down its source. By morning it was gone, so completely gone that I wondered if I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. Over the following days, I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. The way shadows fell differently in certain rooms, as if the light was bending around something I couldn't see. The way my reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes seemed to lag behind my movements just for a fraction of a second. The way electronic devices would flicker or hum when I walked past them, as if responding to some frequency I was carrying without knowing it. I told myself I was being paranoid, stress probably. I'd been working long hours, not getting enough sleep, spending too much time alone. Isolation does things to the mind, makes you notice patterns that aren't really there, assign meaning to coincidences that are just coincidences. But the radio kept turning itself on. Every few nights I'd hear that same static drifting up from the basement. I'd go down and find the radio glowing, its antenna extended like a metal finger pointing towards something I couldn't see. Each time I'd unplug it. Each time I'd find it plugged in again the next day, though I was certain I was the only person with access to the house. I started leaving things in specific positions, a pen on my desk, a book on the coffee table, a coffee mug in the kitchen, small markers that would tell me if someone else had been inside while I was out. But nothing ever moved, nothing except the radio, which continued its nightly broadcasts to an audience of one. The sounds changed too. What had started as simple static began to develop complexity, layers of noise that suggested structure, purpose. Sometimes I thought I could hear my name buried in the interference, spoken in a voice that was almost familiar but not quite. Sometimes the hum would shift in frequency, rising and falling like breathing, like something alive trying to communicate through the limitations of an old machine. I bought a new radio, thinking maybe the old one was just malfunctioning. I put it in the basement next to the original, tuned to a clear station playing classical music. The next morning, both radios were broadcasting the same static, the same impossible signal that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. That's when I started to understand that this wasn't about the radios at all. The house was listening to something, and that something had begun to listen back. I remember the night when everything changed, when I finally accepted that my rational explanations were just elaborate ways of avoiding a truth I wasn't ready to face. I was in my office, working late as usual, when the familiar static started up from the basement. But this time it was accompanied by something new, a pressure in the air, like the feeling you get before a thunderstorm, when the atmosphere becomes dense and electric. My computer screen flickered, once then again, then settled into a steady, almost imperceptible pulse. The cursor moved across the document I'd been typing, deleting words I'd written, replacing them with others. I watched, frozen, as my own work was rewritten before my eyes. You're not alone anymore. I jerked my hands away from the keyboard, but the typing continued. We've been waiting. The room grew colder, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had opened a window to winter in the middle of summer. My breath began to fog small clouds of vapor that shouldn't have been possible. The static from the basement grew louder, more insistent, and underneath it I could hear something else, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the concrete floor below. But I was alone in the house, I was certain of that. The typing stopped, the screen went black, then slowly white text appeared against the darkness. "Come downstairs." I should have run. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get out of the house, to grab my keys and drive as far away as possible. But something stronger than instinct held me in place, a curiosity that felt foreign, as if it wasn't entirely my own. I wanted to go downstairs. I needed to go downstairs. The compulsion was so strong it felt like gravity, pulling me toward the basement door. I walked through the hallway in a daze, my bare feet silent on the wooden floors. The basement door was already open, though I was certain I'd closed it. The light was on, casting its weak yellow glow up the stairs. The static was so loud now it seemed to vibrate in my bones, and underneath it I could hear them clearly, voices, multiple voices, speaking in harmonies that hurt to listen to. I descended the stairs one step at a time, each footfall echoing strangely, as if the sound was being stretched and distorted by the air itself. The basement looked different than it had before, larger somehow. The walls seemed to extend further into darkness, and the shelves that had once held boxes and old furniture now displayed objects I didn't recognize, geometric shapes that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Mirrors that reflected scenes from rooms that didn't exist. The radios were silent now. Both of them sat on their shelf, dark and lifeless, as if they'd served their purpose and were no longer needed. But the voices continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere, speaking words in a language that sounded almost like English but wasn't quite right, wasn't quite human. In the center of the basement floor, where I was certain there had been nothing before, stood a chair. Simple, wooden, unremarkable except for the fact that it was facing me, as if it had been placed there specifically for my arrival. On the seat was a photograph. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was a picture of me, taken from behind, sitting in my office upstairs. But in the photograph, I wasn't alone. Standing behind my chair, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure I didn't recognize, tall, indistinct, with features that seemed to blur and shift even in the static image. I dropped the photograph. It fluttered to the concrete floor, landing face up, but now it showed something different. The same office, the same chair, but empty. And standing in the doorway, as if they'd just entered the room, was the same shadowy figure, clearer now, more defined, staring directly at the camera with eyes that seemed to follow me even through the still image. That's when I heard my own voice coming from the walls around me, speaking words I'd never said. "I've been waiting for you to notice me." The sound was coming from my own mouth, but I wasn't speaking. My lips were moving, forming words I hadn't chosen, controlled by something that wasn't me. The sweet, metallic smell filled the air again, so strong now that it made me gag, and the temperature dropped even further, until my breath was coming in thick white clouds. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I tried to scream, but the only sound that came out was more of those words, that voice that was mine but wasn't. "I've been lonely for so long." The figure in the photograph stepped out of the frame. I don't remember leaving the house. I don't remember packing my things or calling a moving company or giving notice to my landlord. I don't remember the drive to this new place, thousands of miles away, where I thought distance might equal safety. My next clear memory is waking up in this small apartment, surrounded by boxes I didn't remember filling, holding a lease I didn't remember signing. But I remember the feeling of being followed, not by footsteps or shadows, but by something more intimate, the sensation of sharing space with a presence that had learned to exist inside the boundaries of my own skin. I threw away all my electronics, my computer, my phone, my radio, anything that could receive or transmit signals. I told myself it was a fresh start, a return to simpler living. But the truth was I couldn't stand the way they looked at me now, the way their screens would flicker with recognition whenever I came near, as if they were windows for something that was always watching, always waiting. The dreams started a few weeks after I'd settled in. Not nightmares exactly, but something worse, dreams where I was still in that basement, sitting in that wooden chair, having conversations with someone I couldn't see. In the dreams, we talked for hours about things I can't remember when I wake up, but I always wake with the taste of copper in my mouth and the feeling that I've revealed secrets I didn't know I was keeping. Sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking, I can hear my own voice speaking words I've never learned, answering questions I've never been asked. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a mirror or a window, I see something standing behind me that disappears the moment I turn around. I moved here to escape, but I've come to understand that some things don't respect distance. They don't need radios or computers or photographs to maintain their connection. They don't need basements or old houses or any of the physical anchors I thought were containing them. They just need you to notice them once, just once, and then they're part of you forever, like a frequency your mind has learned to receive, a signal you can never fully tune out. I'm telling you this because I think it's important that someone knows, not as a warning. I don't think warnings would help anyway, but as a record maybe, as evidence that some doors once opened change everything that comes after. I still smell that sweet metallic scent sometimes, usually late at night when the air grows still and thick. I still feel that pressure in my chest when I'm near anything electronic, as if my body has become a conductor for signals I can't decode. And I still hear my own voice speaking words I haven't chosen, having conversations with someone who isn't there. Or maybe they are there, maybe they've always been there, and I just finally learned how to notice them. The apartment is quiet now. It's always quiet, but quiet doesn't mean alone, does it? It just means that whatever else is sharing this space with me has learned to move without making sound, to breathe without disturbing the air, to exist in the spaces between my thoughts where I can't quite reach them. I thought distance would help. I thought new walls and new locks and a new address would be enough to start over, to leave behind whatever I'd invited into my life in that basement. But I understand now that some invitations can't be rescinded, some doors can't be closed, some connections can't be severed by something as simple as geography. They're still with me, they've always been with me. And as I sit here in this small apartment, thousands of miles from where it all began, I can feel them listening to every word I speak, watching me through eyes that exist just outside my peripheral vision, waiting patiently for me to finally stop running and accept what I've become. I'm not alone anymore. I haven't been alone for a very long time. And neither, I suspect, are you, Story 7. It was the scent of overripe oranges that greeted me, clinging to the air in the hallway, sweet, almost intoxicating, yet distinctly out of place in a house that hadn't seen fresh fruit in weeks. I hesitated at the threshold, the unexpected aroma unraveling a string of memories I had long secured away. The walls seemed to lean in as if drawn by my confusion, and for a moment the hallway appeared narrower, tighter. I moved forward, drawn by a compulsion to find the source. The air grew dense with the scent, each step thickening the atmosphere. I remembered that smell from another house, another time when the past felt like it could be rewritten. I shouldn't have followed it, but I did. The buzzing started 3 weeks ago, or was it 3 months? Time moves strangely now, folding in on itself like wet paper. I wake up with the taste of copper on my tongue and my fingertips numb, as if I've been gripping something too tightly in my sleep. The sheets are always twisted, always damp with sweat that smells faintly of ozone. I keep finding myself standing in rooms I don't remember entering. The kitchen window faces east, but sometimes the light comes from the wrong direction. I've checked the compass on my phone. North is still north, but the shadows fall upward in the morning, pooling on the ceiling like spilled ink. I blink and they're gone, normal again, painting their familiar patterns on the linoleum floor. There's a door in my bedroom that I never noticed before. It's painted the same white as the walls, seamless except for the brass handle that's always slightly warm to the touch. I've lived here for years. I know every corner, every crack in the plaster. But there it is, half open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The humming comes from inside the walls, low, constant, like electricity running through old wiring. But the power company checked everything twice. They found nothing wrong. They couldn't hear it. Their instruments showed normal readings, clean power, perfect connections, but I hear it, especially at night when the rest of the world goes quiet. Sometimes I catch myself humming along. The scent of oranges returns without warning. I'll be washing dishes or folding laundry, and suddenly the air thickens with that cloying sweetness. It pulls at something deep in my chest, a recognition that feels older than memory. My hands shake when it happens. My vision blurs at the edges, like looking through water. I don't remember ever coming back. The dreams are fragments, pieces of glass that cut when I try to hold them. There's always light, too bright, too white, coming from somewhere above. My skin tingles under it, every nerve ending alive and singing. I'm lying on something soft, but my body feels distant, disconnected. Voices speak in frequencies I can almost understand, words that taste like metal and smell like rain. I wake up and my bedroom door is open, the one that shouldn't exist, the one that leads nowhere. There were lights behind the trees. The grocery store feels different now. Fluorescent bulbs flicker in patterns that seem deliberate, like Morse code spelled out in light. The checkout scanner beeps in rhythms that match the humming in my walls. Other customers move too slowly, their faces slightly out of focus, as if I'm seeing them through thick glass. I bought oranges yesterday. I don't remember putting them in my cart. The tingling starts in my fingertips and spreads up my arms like warm honey. It happens when I'm not expecting it, when I'm focused on something else entirely. Reading a book, watching television, brushing my teeth. Suddenly my skin comes alive, every cell vibrating at a frequency that makes my teeth ache. The air tastes sharp, metallic, like licking a battery. I find myself in the hallway again, following that sweet, rotting scent. The walls breathe with my pulse, expanding and contracting in slow, hypnotic rhythms. My feet move without conscious direction, carrying me towards something I can't name but desperately need to find. The door is wider open now. The darkness beyond shifts and moves, not empty but full of something I can't see, something that sees me. The noise didn't come from outside. Time skips like a scratched record. I'm making coffee, then I'm standing in the backyard with no memory of walking there. The sun is in the wrong position, casting shadows that belong to a different hour. My coffee is cold in my hands, the mug slick with condensation that shouldn't form in dry air. The grass beneath my feet feels artificial, too perfect, each blade exactly the same height and color. When I kneel to touch it, my fingers pass through it like it's made of light. The humming grows louder. It's not coming from the walls anymore. It's coming from everywhere, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through my bones. I close my eyes and let it wash over me, and for a moment I remember. White light, soft surfaces, the smell of ozone and overripe fruit. I open my eyes and I'm back in the kitchen. The oranges on the counter are perfectly fresh, their skin bright and unblemished. I don't remember when I bought them. I don't remember bringing them home. One of them has a small puncture mark, perfectly round, as if something thin and sharp had been inserted into it. The door in my bedroom stands fully open now. The darkness beyond breathes with a life of its own, warm air flowing in and out like lungs. Sometimes I hear sounds from the other side, footsteps that don't quite match human gaits, whispers in frequencies that bypass my ears and speak directly to my bones. I should be afraid, part of me knows this, but the fear feels distant, muffled, like it belongs to someone else. My reflection in the bathroom mirror shows things that aren't there, lights moving behind my eyes, marks on my skin that fade when I look directly at them. Sometimes I catch myself speaking to the mirror, having conversations I can't remember starting. The other me never answers back. There were lights behind the trees, and they were calling me home. The tingling spreads through my entire body now, a constant low-level vibration that makes everything feel unreal. I move through my house like I'm underwater, every action slow and deliberate. Objects seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them. The furniture rearranges itself in subtle ways, chairs turned at slightly different angles, books moved from shelf to shelf. The oranges are rotting now, their skin soft and yielding, releasing that sweet, cloying scent into the air. But when I reach for them, they feel firm and fresh under my fingers. The contradiction doesn't bother me anymore. Nothing bothers me anymore. I'm learning to accept the inconsistencies. The voices in the walls grow clearer each night. They speak in harmonics that resonate in my chest, words that I understand without hearing. They tell me stories about light and time and the spaces between thoughts. They tell me I'm ready. I don't know what I'm ready for. The door in my bedroom isn't a door anymore. It's an opening, a passage that leads somewhere else entirely. The darkness beyond has texture now, depth, like looking into deep water. Sometimes I see movement in there, shapes that might be familiar if I could focus on them properly. I've started walking toward it. The scent of oranges fills every room now, so thick I can taste it with each breath. Sweet and rotten and somehow alive, it coats the inside of my mouth and nose. My skin prickles with constant electricity. The humming has become part of my heartbeat, synchronized with my pulse, with my breathing, with the rhythm of my thoughts. I remember lying on something soft while light poured over me like water. I remember voices that spoke without words, hands that touched without pressure. I remember agreeing to something, nodding yes to a question I didn't understand. I remember the taste of copper and ozone and overripe fruit. The hallway stretches longer than it should, walls breathing in slow, hypnotic rhythms. Each step takes me further from where I started, deeper into something that isn't quite my house anymore. The air grows thick, viscous, like moving through honey. The opening waits at the end of the hall, no longer pretending to be a bedroom door. It pulses with soft light, warm and welcoming. The darkness beyond shifts and moves, full of possibilities I can almost understand. I don't remember ever coming back, but I remember leaving. My feet carry me forward without conscious thought. The tingling in my skin builds to a crescendo, every nerve ending alive and singing. The scent of oranges overwhelms everything else, so intense it becomes a physical presence, wrapping around me like arms. The light beyond the opening grows brighter, more welcoming. I can hear voices now, familiar somehow, calling me home. The humming reaches a perfect pitch, harmonizing with the rhythm of my heart, with the frequency of my thoughts. I step forward. The world dissolves into white light and the taste of copper and the scent of overripe oranges clinging to the air. Time stops, or maybe I stop, suspended in a moment that stretches like taffy. I feel hands that aren't quite hands, voices that aren't quite voices, welcoming me back to a place I never knew I'd left. I understand now why I couldn't remember. I wake up in my bed, sheets twisted and damp with sweat that smells like ozone. The bedroom door is closed, painted white, seamless against the wall. There's no handle, no opening, no passage to anywhere else. But the scent of overripe oranges clings to the air in the hallway, sweet and intoxicating and distinctly out of place. I hesitate at the threshold, the unexpected aroma unraveling a string of memories I thought I had secured away. The walls seem to line in, drawn by my confusion. I shouldn't follow it, but I will. Story 8. I mentioned I'd only stayed on the ground floor, that the rain had kept me near the entrance, away from anything more. They seemed satisfied, jotting notes in rhythm with the drizzle outside. Yet the damp scent of old wood lingered on my fingertips, stubborn and telling. The stairs had creaked a note that still echoed in my mind, carrying the weight of untold steps. A slight draft brushed my cheek with the chill of an unwelcome memory. The hallway light flickered, casting shadows that knew my path. I didn't mention the door half ajar or the coat beside it, but the mud was drying on my shoes. The lie sits comfortable now, worn smooth like a stone in my pocket. I can feel its weight when I shift in this chair, listening to their pens scratch across paper. My hands rest flat on the table, but underneath, my thumb traces the same pattern it learned upstairs, a nervous habit born from touching something I shouldn't have touched. The fluorescent light above us hums the same frequency as the one that guided me through that hallway. They don't know I can still smell the must of old fabric clinging to my sleeve. Before they arrived with their questions and clipboards, I sat alone in my kitchen, watching steam rise from a cup of coffee I couldn't drink. The silence felt different then, loaded with the memory of footsteps that weren't mine. My reflection in the window showed a face I recognized, but the eyes belonged to someone who had seen too much. The phone had rung twice before I answered. Their voices were professional, concerned. They wanted to know about my visit, about what I'd witnessed. I agreed to meet them here, in this sterile room that smells nothing like that place. Drive home had been automatic, my hands steering while my mind replayed the sound of that door clicking shut behind me. Rain drummed against the windshield in patterns that reminded me of fingers tapping on wood. Every red light gave me time to study my hands on the wheel, to notice how they trembled just slightly. The radio played soft jazz that couldn't quite cover the echo of my own breathing in that narrow space. I kept checking the rearview mirror, not for other cars, but for something else entirely. Something that might have followed me. Standing in the rain outside that building, I had felt the weight of what I'd discovered pressing against my chest like a physical thing. The drops that hit my face mixed with something that might have been tears, though I couldn't remember starting to cry. My car waited at the curb, ordinary and safe, but the distance between the front door and the driver's seat felt vast. Each step away from that place should have brought relief, but instead the knot in my stomach tightened. The building watched me live through dark windows, patient and knowing. The descent down those stairs had been careful, deliberate, each step placed with the precision of someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. My hand slid along the banister, and I could feel decades of other palms that had made the same journey. The wood was smooth in some places, rough in others, telling stories through texture. Behind me, the hallway stretched like a held breath. The light I'd left on up there created a pale rectangle at the top of the stairs, but it felt miles away. My shoes whispered against the worn carpet, keeping time with my heartbeat. In that upstairs hallway, the air had tasted of dust and something else, something organic and patient. The floorboards beneath the thin carpet had their own language, creaking out warnings with each step I took toward that partially open door. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting everything in harsh whites and deep blacks. No gray areas, no gentle shadows to soften what I might find. The walls were closer together than they'd seemed from the stairwell, creating a tunnel effect that drew me forward despite every instinct screaming to turn back. The door itself had been unremarkable, painted white but yellowed with age around the edges. It hung open just enough to suggest rather than reveal. The gap was maybe 6 inches, wide enough to see that there was something beyond, but narrow enough to hide the details. I remember standing there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, listening to the building settle around me. The silence was so complete it had weight, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own pulse. That's when I noticed the coat hanging on a hook, just visible through the crack. It was brown wool, the kind of coat that had been expensive once but now showed its age in the way it hung, shoulders slightly collapsed, hem frayed at the edges. What made me push the door wider wasn't the coat itself, but the fact that it was still damp. In a building that had been empty for months, that coat held moisture like it had just come in from the rain. The fabric looked heavy with it, and when I stepped closer, I could smell the petrichor scent of wet earth and growing things. My hand reached out before my mind could stop it, fingers brushing against the wool. It was cold, too cold. The room beyond that door had been a study or office once. Bookshelves lined the walls, though most of the volumes had been removed, leaving behind only dust outlines and the occasional forgotten paperback. A desk sat beneath the single window, its surface clear except for a thin layer of dust that showed finger marks. Someone had been touching things, moving objects around, disturbing the settled quiet of abandonment. The chair behind the desk was pulled out slightly, as if someone had just stood up and walked away. The seat cushion still held a slight depression. Before I'd climbed those stairs, I had stood at the bottom looking up into darkness that seemed to have texture, like black velvet hanging in the air. The staircase curved slightly, hiding the upper floor from view. Each step was worn smooth in the center, polished by countless feet over the years. The handrail felt solid under my palm, anchoring me to something real as I began to climb. The house around me was so quiet I could hear my own clothes rustling with each movement. That's when I first noticed the smell, faint but persistent, drifting down from above like an invitation. I had entered through the front door, which had been unlocked despite what I'd been told. The key they'd given me turned easily, but the door had swung open before I could push it. The foyer was dim, lit only by gray light filtering through dirty windows. Dust motes danced in the pale beams, and my footsteps echoed off hardwood floors that had once been beautiful. The air inside was still and cool, carrying scents of old wood and something else, something that made me think of gardens after dark. A staircase rose along the right wall, disappearing into shadows above. The building had looked ordinary from the outside, 3 stories of brick and mortar that could have been an office or apartment complex. Nothing about its facade suggested the weight of what waited inside. I had parked across the street and sat in my car for several minutes, studying the windows for any sign of movement. They stared back, dark and empty, reflecting nothing but sky. The rain had started then, light drops that tapped against my windshield like fingernails. I remember thinking how the building seemed to line slightly toward the street, as if it were listening to the traffic below. They had asked me to check on the place, just a simple favor for someone who couldn't make the trip themselves. The key was old brass, heavy in my palm, attached to a ring with no other keys. They'd explained that the building had been empty for months, that they just needed someone to walk through, make sure everything was secure. Simple enough. Nothing about their request had seemed unusual, though now I wonder about the way they'd avoided my eyes when they handed me that key. The way they'd mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I should probably stick to the ground floor. But before any of that, before the key and the request and the drive across town, there had been a phone call. Late in the evening, the kind of call that comes when you're settling into the quiet rhythms of another ordinary night. The voice on the other end had been familiar but strained, speaking in careful sentences about a favor they needed, a building they couldn't visit themselves. They'd apologized for the short notice, for the inconvenience. But there had been something else in their voice, something that made me say yes before I'd fully understood what they were asking. Something that sounded almost like relief, as if they'd been holding their breath, waiting for someone else to take responsibility for whatever waited in that place. The conversation had started simply enough, with pleasantries about the weather and mutual acquaintances. But I can trace it back now to the exact moment when their tone changed, when the casual chat became something else entirely. They'd paused, and in that silence I heard something that might have been fear. When they spoke again, their words came faster, as if they needed to get them out before they lost their nerve. They mentioned the building almost casually, like it was an afterthought rather than the real reason for their call. But their voice caught slightly on the address, stumbling over numbers that should have been simple to say. And before that call, in the hours when I was still innocent of what was coming, I had been reading in my favorite chair by the window. The book was forgettable, something to pass the time on a quiet evening. Outside, the world was settling into darkness, streetlights beginning to flicker on one by one. I remember feeling content, safe in my small routines and familiar spaces. The phone sat silent on the table beside me, just another piece of furniture in a room that knew my habits. I had no way of knowing that when it finally rang, it would be the sound of everything changing. No way to know that the voice on the other end would set me on a path toward that brown coat, that empty room, that door hanging open like a question I wasn't prepared to answer. Story 9. The notification light didn't blink. My fingers brushed the screen, seeking the familiar vibration, but it remained inert, unresponsive. The chair creaked under my weight without the usual reassuring groan, as though it too held its breath. The room drew in closer, the quiet pressing at the edges, and when I expected the distant hum of distant traffic, there was only a void. I focused on the wallpaper's pattern, each line and swirl pretending, as if any moment they might shift and betray their true design. The absence filled the space, tangible, as if daring me to acknowledge what had ceased to exist. I've been sitting here for hours now, watching the shadows stretch across the floor in ways that don't match the position of the sun. The silence has weight to it, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. Every electronic device in this room has fallen quiet, not broken, not unplugged, just silent. The refrigerator stopped humming 3 days ago. The clock on the wall shows the same time it showed yesterday, its hands frozen in perpetual afternoon. They don't believe me when I tell them about the sleeplessness. How can you explain to someone that sleep itself has changed, that the darkness behind your eyelids now carries textures and movements that weren't there before? The dreams, when they come, aren't dreams at all. They're memories trying to surface through thick water, distorted and heavy with meaning I can't quite grasp. The house settles differently now. Wood expands and contracts with temperatures that don't exist, creating sounds that follow no pattern I recognize. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the walls, not above or below, but inside the very structure, as if something moves through spaces that shouldn't be there. The floorboards respond to weight that casts no shadow. My skin remembers things my mind can't. There's a persistent tingling along my arms, a sensation like static electricity that never discharges. When I touch metal surfaces, they feel warm even in the cold, and sometimes they vibrate with a frequency I can feel in my bones but can't hear. The air itself seems thicker some days, requiring more effort to breathe, carrying scents that belong nowhere on earth. The neighbors have stopped looking at me directly. They turn their heads just slightly when we pass, as if avoiding eye contact with something they can't quite identify but instinctively fear. Children cross the street. Dogs whimper and pull their owners in different directions. Even insects seem to avoid the space around me, creating small circles of emptiness wherever I stand. I've been trying to piece together what happened out there, in that place where the trees grew too straight and the ground felt hollow beneath my feet. The memory sits like a stone in still water, sending ripples backward through everything that came before. I can see the shape of it now, the outline of something vast and patient that watched from a distance I couldn't measure. It was the figure that changed everything. Standing motionless against the tree line, neither approaching nor retreating, just observing with an attention that felt physical, like fingers tracing the surface of my thoughts. The proportions were wrong, too tall and too still, casting shadows that bent in impossible directions. When I tried to look directly at it, my eyes would slide away, focusing on anything else, as if my vision itself refused to acknowledge what stood there. The air around that figure shimmered with heat that had no source, creating distortions that made the forest behind it seem to breathe. Sound died in its presence. No birds, no insects, no whisper of wind through leaves. Just the figure and the weight of its attention, pressing against my consciousness like a slow tide. I remember now the way time stretched and contracted around that moment. What felt like hours of watching might have been minutes, or perhaps seconds extended into infinity. My body remained frozen while my mind raced, trying to categorize, to understand, to find some familiar reference point in what defied every natural law I knew. But before the figure, there were signs I should have recognized. The electronic disturbances had been building for days. Radios picking up signals that weren't broadcasts, just patterns of sound that seemed almost like language but carried no meaning I could decode. My phone would receive calls with no number, connecting to silence that felt occupied, as if something listened from the other end without breathing. The lights began their strange behavior well before I saw what cast no shadow in the forest. Street lamps would flicker in sequence as I passed beneath them, creating waves of illumination that followed my movement too precisely to be coincidence. Inside, bulbs would dim and brighten in rhythms that matched no electrical pattern, sometimes pulsing in sync with my heartbeat, as if the house itself had learned to monitor my vital signs. Temperature became unreliable. Rooms would grow cold while the thermostat registered warmth, creating pockets of air that felt like walking through invisible walls of ice. Other spaces would radiate heat that had no source, warming my skin while leaving the air around me untouched. The sensations never lasted long enough to measure, but they accumulated, building a map of impossible climate changes within familiar walls. The metallic taste started then, coating my tongue with the flavor of copper and ozone, as if I'd been breathing the air after lightning strikes. It would come in waves, sometimes mild, sometimes so intense it made swallowing difficult. Water tasted different, carrying minerals that shouldn't exist in the local supply, leaving my mouth dry despite drinking constantly. Going further back, I can trace the beginning to subtler disturbances. The ground beneath my feet would vibrate at frequencies too low to hear, but strong enough to feel in my chest cavity. Walking across familiar terrain became uncertain, as if the earth itself had developed a pulse that didn't match any natural rhythm. Concrete sidewalks would transmit tremors that seemed to originate from impossible depths, traveling through solid matter with the persistence of underground rivers. My reflection began to lag in mirrors and windows, creating a delay between movement and image that lasted just long enough to notice. The disconnect was subtle but persistent, making every glimpse of myself feel like looking at someone else, someone who moved a fraction of a second behind my intentions. Glass surfaces would hold my image even after I turned away, creating peripheral glimpses of a person who should no longer be there. The earliest sign, the one I dismissed as fatigue or stress, was the way my attention would drift without warning. I'd find myself staring at empty spaces, losing minutes at a time while my mind seemed to float somewhere outside my body. During these episodes, the world would continue around me, but I'd observe it from a distance that felt both protective and terrifying, as if something had gently lifted my consciousness away from immediate experience. Those moments of disconnection carried their own sensory landscape. Colors would appear more vivid but somehow artificial, like looking at reality through filters that enhanced certain frequencies while dampening others. Sounds would reach me through layers of invisible material, muffled but strangely clarified, as if distance had somehow improved rather than diminished their quality. The very beginning feels almost peaceful now, knowing what followed. I was standing in an open field, watching the sun set through perfectly ordinary clouds. The grass moved with natural wind, birds called from nearby trees, and the air carried the simple sense of earth and growing things. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had always been. But even in that moment of normalcy, something was already watching from beyond the tree line, patient and vast, beginning its slow approach through dimensions I couldn't perceive. The peaceful evening was already compromised, already changed by the presence of something that existed in spaces between spaces, casting shadows that fell upward into a sky that would never again look quite the same. And now it waits somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths, measuring the distance it needs to cross to complete what it started in that innocent field under an ordinary sunset. Story 10. The initial assessment showed all windows latched securely. Furniture placement appeared untouched, with chairs aligned to the dining table and the sofa free of debris. A calendar on the wall noted dates without any markings beyond printed numbers. In the kitchen, utensils were stowed correctly, though a single plate remained on the countertop, devoid of residue. The refrigerator hummed at the expected decibel level, yet its contents failed to match inventory records. The hallway carpet was vacuumed, leaving uniform lines, yet the air felt colder than usual. The ceiling fan was off, but the blades rotated slowly. I remember writing that report. I think I remember writing that report. The words feel familiar in my mouth when I speak them aloud, like reciting something learned long ago. But when I try to recall why I was conducting an assessment, or what kind of assessment it was, the memory dissolves like sugar in water. It started with the first dream, though I didn't know it was the first of many then. I was lying in my bed, the same bed I've slept in for years, but something was different. There was a light coming through the window, not sunlight or street light, but something else entirely. An oval light, unmoving but pulsing like a breath, always above me. I remember thinking it was probably just a helicopter or maybe someone with a flashlight in the yard. Stress does strange things to sleep, and I'd been under pressure lately. Work deadlines, family obligations, the usual weight that settles on your chest when you're not paying attention. so I rolled over and went back to sleep. But the light stayed with me. Even with my eyes closed, even facing the wall, I could feel it there, watching, waiting. When I woke up, everything was normal. Coffee tasted like coffee. The morning news droned about traffic and weather. I showered, dressed, went about my day. By afternoon, I'd nearly forgotten about the dream entirely. Nearly. The second time, the dream lasted longer. I was in the same position, lying on my back, but now I could hear something. A constant hum, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it made my teeth ache. The oval light was still there, pulsing in rhythm with the sound, and I realized I couldn't move. Not couldn't move like sleep paralysis. I'd experienced that before, the crushing weight on your chest, the inability to scream. This was different. I simply had no desire to move. Moving seemed unnecessary, almost rude, as if I was supposed to lie there and listen. The humming grew more complex, layered. Underneath the main tone, I could hear something that might have been a voice, metallic, processed, like someone speaking through water. I strained to understand the words, but they slipped away from me, always just beyond comprehension. I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body moved. The sensation was gentle, like floating in warm water, but there was an urgency to it that made my heart race. The voice continued, patient and persistent, and I had the strangest feeling it was asking me questions. When I woke up, my sheets were soaked with sweat. I checked the window, but it was closed and locked, just as I'd left it. No sign of any light outside. I made a mental note to cut back on caffeine before bed. But throughout the day, I kept catching myself humming. The same frequency from the dream, or what I thought was the same frequency. Every time I realized I was doing it, I'd stop, but within an hour I'd catch myself again. My coworkers didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they were too polite to mention it. That evening I found a small circular bruise on my forearm, purple and precise like a thumbprint. I couldn't remember bumping into anything, but bruises appear for all sorts of reasons. I bruise easily anyway, always have. The third dream came the next week. By then, I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing was stress-related, maybe a side effect of the new vitamin supplements I'd started taking. But this time, the experience was more vivid than my waking life had been in months. I was in the same position, but now I could see the room around me with perfect clarity, even though it was dark. Every detail was sharp and present. The texture of the ceiling, the way shadows fell across the walls, the dust mote suspended in the air. The oval light was closer now, close enough that I could see it wasn't coming from outside at all. It was in the room with me. The humming was louder, more insistent, and the metallic voice was clearer. Still not clear enough to understand, but clear enough to recognize as definitely a voice. It was asking me something over and over with infinite patience. I wanted to answer, but I didn't know what it was asking. I didn't know what language it was speaking. Time moved strangely in the dream. I felt like I was there for hours, listening, trying to understand, but when I checked later, I'd only been asleep for 20 minutes. The sensation of being lifted was stronger now, and I could feel something touching me. Not hands exactly, but something careful and deliberate, examining. A sharp scent filled the air, like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more artificial. It reminded me of hospitals, but not quite. More like the smell of new electronics, but organic somehow, living. I woke up with the taste of metal in my mouth. The next day I noticed my radio was acting strangely. It would tune itself to empty frequencies, filling the house with static. When I tried to adjust it, it would work normally for a few minutes, then drift back to the white noise. I unplugged it, but even then I swore I could still hear the humming. My neighbors started acting differently around me, not unfriendly exactly, but distant, like they were seeing something I couldn't see. When I asked if everything was all right, they'd smile and nod, but their eyes would dart away quickly. One of them mentioned that my porch light had been flickering all week, but when I checked, it was working fine. I found more bruises, small, circular, always in places I wouldn't normally bump into things. My inner arm, the back of my neck, my ankle. They didn't hurt, but they were perfectly round and evenly spaced, like someone had been taking measurements. The dreams began to bleed into my waking hours. I'd be sitting at my desk, concentrating on work when I'd hear the humming, just for a few seconds, barely audible but unmistakable. I'd look around, but no one else seemed to notice. Electronics would flicker when I walked past them. Streetlights would dim as I approached. I started losing time, not dramatically, just small gaps. I'd be reading a book and realize I'd been staring at the same page for an hour without reading a word. I'd start driving somewhere and arrive with no memory of the journey. The radio in my car would be tuned to static, though I never remembered changing it. Sleep became something I both craved and dreaded. The dreams were more real than reality now, more vivid and immediate than anything in my waking life. In the dreams, everything made sense. The voice was trying to communicate something important, something I needed to know. The examinations were necessary, though I couldn't understand why. The lifting sensation was preparation for something that was coming. But when I woke up, the certainty would fade, leaving only fragments and the growing suspicion that these weren't dreams at all. I started finding things in my house that didn't belong to me. A pen I'd never seen before on my nightstand. A book I didn't remember buying on my coffee table. A plant in my kitchen that I was somehow keeping alive despite having no memory of watering it. When I asked friends if they'd left these things, they looked at me with the same distant expression my neighbors had started wearing. The assessment report kept appearing on my desk. I'd throw it away, but it would be back the next morning, written in my handwriting, describing my own house as if I were a stranger conducting an investigation. The details were accurate but clinical, noting things I'd never consciously observed. The single plate on the countertop that I couldn't remember using. The inventory discrepancies in my refrigerator that I couldn't explain. The slow rotation of the ceiling fan that shouldn't have been moving at all. I began to suspect that the dreams weren't dreams, but memories. Memories of something that had really happened, something that was still happening. The voice wasn't asking me questions in some unknown language. It was asking me questions I'd already answered over and over until the answers had worn grooves in my mind deep enough to forget. The bruises weren't from examinations, they were from procedures. The time I was losing wasn't lost at all. It was being used for something I wasn't supposed to remember. The humming wasn't coming from the dreams. The dreams were coming from the humming, like a signal calling me back to a place I'd never left. Last night I had the dream again. The same position, the same oval light, the same gentle lifting sensation. But this time when the metallic voice spoke, I understood every word. It wasn't asking me questions anymore. It was giving me instructions, preparing me for something that was about to begin. When I woke up, everything was normal. Coffee tasted like coffee. The morning news droned about traffic and weather. I showered, dressed, went about my day. But when I reached for my coffee cup, I noticed something that made my blood turn cold. My fingerprints were gone. The tips of my fingers were smooth and unmarked, as if they'd been carefully sanded away and were just beginning to grow back. I stared at them in the morning light, turning my hands over and over, but there was no mistaking what I was seeing. I looked around my kitchen, at the single plate on the countertop, at the refrigerator humming at its expected frequency, at the ceiling fan that wasn't running but somehow still turning. Everything was exactly as described in the assessment report. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except for my fingerprints. Except for the fact that I was awake, completely awake, and I could still hear the humming.